Being a professional combat officer in this galaxy is all about solving problems. Tactical. Strategic. Logistical. Technical, if you're a spacer or armor jockey. And then there's the kind of shit that you only have to deal with when you're me, Hargren of Stormhill, captain of the privateer cruiser Harlot's Blade. So, you think my chief engineer is going to murder my cyber warfare officer over pornography? The question was addressed to my Iratrian medical officer, Dawnlight seen through morning mists across a forest lake. Which I shortened to Dawn, because I'm a busy woman and because a Zard being culturally insensitive should surprise no one. I was always a little ambivalent about Dawn, anyway. On the one hand, she was a truly gifted trauma surgeon, practically a miracle worker when it came to keeping the wounded and the mangled from meeting their gods in person. On the other, she was irritatingly wholesome and do-gooderish, naturally, because she was an Iratrian. She was also unforgivably civilian. Like, she'd stand out as really civilian even among a regular civilian crew. Extra super limited edition civilian, I guess. But we'd rescued her from a Ribothy slave ship and she was grateful and I'd been in urgent need of a replacement medic. Also, she had the cutest little butt and I was drinking when I hired her. Dawn clattered a forehoof on the deck in an Iratrian gesture of assent. She was a low-slung quadruped, striped in eye-watering pink and green, with two long, spindly manipulators sprouting from her mid-back. These were twisting nervously together at the moment, since no Iratrian ever born understands the concept of concealing their emotions. Ms. Ophelia seemed very upset when she found those drawings, she said, big, soulful eyes shimmering with concern. She grabbed a big wrench and set off for the cyber warfare suite before I could talk her down. Her big wrench? This could actually be serious. Chief Engineer Ophelia Opie Walczak was a smug, arrogant, moody, foul-mouthed absolute and total bitch and my very best friend for the past 20 years. She was a human of a subset called Pol, from the planet Chernobog. And as was the way of her nation, she was really only capable of 3 emotional states: depression, revenge, and vodka. And if she'd grabbed her favorite wrench, she sure wasn't depressed. That gal just loved her some blunt force trauma. Right, I said, standing up from my bed, to which I had retired to refresh myself. By which I mean rub one out, because when a gal's got the urge, she's got the urge, you know. But then Dawn had come busting in and, well, guess I'd better go do some actual captain stuff. Personnel management and all that shit. Yes. Please hurry, Captain. Ms. Ophelia will listen to you. Stop her before she does something she'll regret. I nearly laughed at that. If Dawn thought Opie would feel bad about caving Jilakita's feathery skull in, she didn't know Opie very well. Like, at all. Opie Walczak once shot a Vonga mercenary in the face just for calling her Terran. Although if you know the bloody and tragic history of diaspora humans and their relationship with the people of their cradle world, her response was kind of understandable. And it was as much for how it was said as for the epithet itself. Her killing Jilakita would be something I'd regret, I corrected as I followed Dawn into the corridor. Creven are the best computer geeks around and not many of them are as bent as Jilakita. Replacing her would be a serious pain in my ass. The Avioid Creven tend to be a prim and serious-minded bunch, too enamored with stability and security to easily take up criminal hacking and cybercrime. Which illegal lifestyle I had redeemed Jilakita from and was not at all letting her carry on with anymore. Because calling it cyber warfare instead means it's a military specialization rather than a felony. Dawn shot me a worried little side eye. But, you're worried about Jilakita as a person, right? I'm worried about her primarily as an owner trying to run a profitable business. You know, the thing that keeps all you silly bitches paid and fed. Not to mention alive, since our business is high-risk combat ops. Dawn shook her head as we hustled to the step lift that went to the control deck. Ugh. Don't remind me, she muttered. I grabbed the rung beside Dawn as she tapped the up arrow and let the step lift haul us upwards. If you hate it, why did you sign on? I asked. She waggled her head side to side, the Iratrian version of a shrug. I owe you my life, Captain Hargren. I was a mind-stapled slave of the Ribothi for 3 years. Do you know what it's like to be trapped in a corner of your own brain, watching yourself carry out the commands of vile strangers who view you as livestock that talks and being unable to even scream or cry about it? She shivered as we exited the step lift together. For saving me from that, I'll follow you wherever you care to go. Even if I don't like it. Even if I often loathe it. That made me frown hard. I can be a pretty shitty person sometimes, but forcing people to do things against their will has never been one of my kinks. If you hate being a mercenary and living this way so much, it doesn't seem all that different from you being back with the Ribothi. It's totally different, Captain. Because I choose to stay with you. Ah. Yeah, that was a valid point. Also. She went on, manipulators suddenly doing a fidgety little tapping. I kind of think you need a, Dawn chewed her lip for a moment. Let's call it a moderating influence. A sort of, moral reminder or supervision. I snickered so hard at that, it made my muzzle itch. If you're appointing yourself my personal fun police, Dawn, you've got your work cut out for you. I'm not drinking less booze, killing less scumbags, or eating less pussy for anybody. Dawn got that huffy, tight-mouthed look Iratrians get when they're miffed at you but too polite to say so. But all she said was, I think you mean fewer scumbags, not less, Captain. So you're the grammar police, too, huh? Our banter had to stop at that moment, because the corridor ahead was filled with a cacophony of pounding metal and guttural snarling that only I and maybe 1 or 2 other crew members would recognize as creative and detailed vulgarities about Crevan parentage and mating practices in diaspora Polish. The profanity made me want to laugh, because only Opie could be so inventive yet so precise in accusing someone of being descended from a line of excrement-consuming sibling impregnators. And because all vulgarity sounds extra vulgar in a Slavic language. But as for the rest of that noise. Ophelia Jadwiga Walczak. I roared. Full name, too, so she'd know I was serious. Belay that shit right now. Damage my ship, and it's coming out of your pay and your ass. The banging stopped. The profanity increased in speed and volume and started including my name in it. We found Opie glaring at the entrance to the cyber warfare suite, the door of which was firmly shut, the indicator lights glowing the bright orange of Condition 1 lockdown mode. That was the security level we used for serious boarding actions, like that time the Tark Imperium set an ambush and got half a company of armored shock marines aboard before we could get clear. Probably a wise move on Jilakita's part. Opie in one of her moods was way more dangerous than a few dozen Tarkich in power armor. A few curious onlookers, crew babes who should probably have been at their duty stations, were watching from a safe distance. I debated sending them on their ways, but decided not to just yet. If Opie wanted to make an ass of herself, she ought to have an audience for it. I regarded her with a mixed expression, my whiskers waggling in amusement, my ears flattening in irritation. This was both an accurate reflection of my mood and a way of keeping Opie on her toes. Let her wonder what I was thinking. So, Chief Engineer Walczak. I used her official title, since there were subordinates present. Can you explain why my ship's 3rd officer is howling like a crazed tree screecher at my 5th officer? Opie's jaw trembled as she bit back something about palm slutbuckets, palm being a popular human nickname and/or racial slur for us Zargs. We apparently look like giant evil Pomeranian puppies to them, or so I've been told. Opie herself was a substantial woman by human standards, big and thick and blonde and deceptively soft-looking. Her 3 most notable physical features were a permanent morose scowl, some rather impressive tits, and a punch that hit like a fucking transit bus. But she saw that I was being all professional, so she drew herself up to something approaching respectful attention and replied, because 5th Officer Jilakita drew this, Captain. She thrust a printout at me. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. It was a two-dimensional drawing, black and white and somewhat stylized. I had to turn it a couple of different ways before it finally clicked what it was supposed to represent. After a little sagacious contemplation, I nodded and tapped the intercom button beside the door. Query, yes, Captain, came back to me in chirpy accented but otherwise bland and uninflected galactophonic. Neither Crevan voices nor faces are very expressive to non-Crevan. Fifth Officer Gilakita, could you explain to me the significance of this drawing of a Felra dominatrix writing differential calculus equations all over a human woman's naked breasts? Statement, yes. Statement, physically, it is a page from a graphic novel of my own creation. Assertion, artistically, it represents an act of sexual foreplay between two consenting sapients. I wasn't even surprised. The only people with more ridiculous taste in erotica than nerds are Crevan. I turned back to Opie. And this has put sand in your panties, why, exactly? Opie's pale face flushed red and her habitual bitch's scowl cranked up to twice the bitchiness and half again the scowliness. She stabbed the printout with her finger like she was trying to murder it. Because that's me, she snarled. That's a picture of Rinhala and me. I regarded the picture again. The centauroid in the drawing did bear a strong resemblance to my Felra 7th officer. That mark on her face could have been a scar and that tail might have been a segmented metal prosthetic. It was honestly hard to tell due to the limitations of simple uncolored pen and ink. But the drawing might well have been meant to depict Gunnery Officer Rinhala Rishingara. The four luscious knockers and divine ass were certainly correct. But as for the other person in the picture. You. I don't think so, I told Opie. She puffed up. Who else would be having kinky sex with Rinhala? Hopefully me, I did not say. Because, while I could usually take Opie in a fight, that was kind of like saying I could masturbate with a power sander. I could, but it would in no way be worth the pain and blood it would take to get the job done. Opie and Rinhala had a thing going. I wouldn't call it a romance, because I don't think either one was capable of feeling anything so soft and fuzzy. But they fucked in the aft drone hangar a lot, and doing so seemed to take the edge off Opie's unfocused exasperation with the universe, as well as dialing back Rinhala's astounding bloodlust. Felra are normally all about subtlety and inscrutable elegance. Rinhala was classy and elegant like a finely engraved, perfectly crafted war axe. Beautiful as all Felra seemed to be, her scars didn't detract from that, but gave her character. Like little notches in the war axe blade that come from years of hacking through armor and bone. She'd been what the media calls a non-electively contracted sporting performer, read that as indentured gladiator, to a Lanagactor entertainment mogul in the galactic court before being discarded and handed over to the Ribathi, from whose rodentoid clutches she had immediately and bloodily escaped. Which was good for her, since while the Ribathi use most of the sapients they enslave to keep their infrastructure and civilization going, Felra are kept for fun. Rinhala never talked much about her time with the Lanagactor, at least not to me. Whatever had happened to her there had left her with a controlled and focusable but unrelenting urge to kill the shit out of things. She would switch from stiff professional to carnage machine the moment she got an excuse to go off her leash. Combine that with a downright artistic talent with heavy weapons and starship artillery and she basically became the grim fucking reaper once she heard the words, "Open fire." How could I possibly not want to fuck a woman like that? But Opie had gotten there first and they had their thing and I respected that. So, yeah. If someone was depicting Rinhala Rishangara fucking a human, then the obvious human to depict would be the one the real Rinhala was fucking. Logic, right? But the woman in the drawing didn't look like Opie. I mean, granted, she was chunky like Opie. And blonde like Opie. And had impressive boobs like Opie. But that face. I shook my head. I don't see it. The hell do you mean, you don't see it? Opie puffed up even bigger and tried to loom into my personal space. Which didn't work on me, because I was taller than her and also long accustomed to her blustering. But she did make Dawn squeak and step back, so partial win, I guess. Opie snarled and thrust a finger at the drawing again. Use your eyes, you carpet-assed VD dispenser. One of the reasons it was hard to get mad at Opie for calling me names was that the epithets she came up with were just so entertaining. I put my own finger on the page beside hers. That is not your face. Opie's mouth worked like she was chewing an invisible pork chop. With a snarl of, "Sucka," she snatched the printout out of my hand and thrust it in Dawn's face. "Is that not me?" she demanded. "That's me, right?" Dawn, for her part, flushed like she'd just walked in on her parents making her some siblings and got all twitchy and stammering. She kept turning her head, trying not to look directly at the drawing but too polite to just shut her eyes and nope out of the conversation. "Well. That is, I just did not get that girl sometimes." I'd seen Dawn elbows deep in a crewmember's shredded guts before, patching organs and closing up punctures while the walls exploded around her, just as cool and unfazed as if she were making snacks in her mama's kitchen. But flash her some pussy and she'd turn into a spastic little bundle of nervousness. Crazy, right? I guess, Dawn's eyes were flicking between quick, wincing glances at the picture and longer but more nervous looks at Opie. "I mean, it looks a bit like you. From the neck down, maybe." Opie's stare was as hard as one of her haymaker punches. Dawn, surprisingly, didn't wilt completely in the face of it, but soldiered on in her bumbling herbivorous civilian way. "It's, the expression. That's, the lady in the drawing is smiling, right? And you don't ever. Your face, it always looks like." She tapered off helplessly, waving her manipulators at Opie's perpetual bitch scowl. Said bitch scowl now looked vaguely hurt. "What are you talking about?" "I smile." I shook my head. "Nah. You really don't." "I do, too." I had to sigh at that childish fib. "Opie," I said as solicitously as I could manage, "I've known you for 20 years. Do you remember that boarding action where you bludgeoned a Tark Marine to death with his own squad leader's severed head? Right after doing that, you made the worst fucking pun I have ever heard. You remember that part? The horrifying blood-caked smirk you wore as you made that accursed quip was the nearest thing to a smile I've ever seen on you." "That was not my only smile," Opie insisted. "And that pun was fucking awesome." "No pun is awesome, Opie. Not to any listener ever. And especially not that one." I felt Dawn's slender manipulator tapping my elbow. "Captain, I'll probably wish I hadn't asked, but what kind of pun?" "Browbeat, Dawn." It involved the word browbeat. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Dawn mentally putting that word alongside the concept of bludgeoned with a severed head. She went from looking puzzled to dry heaving in less than a second. Opie's expression didn't look so good either, and not for the same reason. "I can totally smile," she snarled. "See?" And then she attempted to demonstrate. Holy shit. I'd been turning scumbags into corpses for fun and or profit since I was 10 years old. I'd personally killed sapient beings with everything from starship artillery to pocket knives to my own teeth. I'd seen people I loved and people I despised die fast deaths and slow, in peace and in pieces. I'd witnessed every cruelty sapient minds could devise, from extermination camps to compulsory improv poetry. And, possibly because I'm a terrible person, none of that ever fazed me much. But the twisted, bare-toothed rictus that spread across Ophelia Walczak's face right then? That fazed the shit out of me. Words cannot describe how awkward and unnatural that uncoordinated, unpracticed warping of her lips looked. If a virulent plague could simper at you, if a societal collapse could flutter its eyelashes, that would approximate the sheer wrongness of watching Ophelia Walczak try to force her eternal pissed-off glower into something resembling the goofy grin worn by the woman in Gilakita's little artistic masterpiece. Never, I said, holding up a finger for emphasis. Never, fucking ever, Do that with your face again, OP. That's an order from your captain, a request from your friend, and a plea on behalf of everything that has eyes. That's a little harsh, Captain, Dawn admonished me. I mean, I completely agree with the sentiment, but I think you could phrase it a bit more gently. Before OP could make any coherent response to that, she suddenly perked up and looked over my shoulder. At the same time, I caught the slinky four-footed stride of a Felra coming up behind me. As there were only 2 members of that graceful and seductive species on my ship, and being that the sound of that quadrupedal saunter was accompanied by an unsettling scrape that sounded like nothing in the universe but a dainty prosthetic tail tip made of weapons-grade duralloy being lightly dragged across starship deckplates, it could only be one person. I understand that I have been insulted, purred Rinhala as she came up to join our little conference. That's what we're trying to determine, I replied. Gods, but the woman was hot. Felra seemed to have a gift for making anything they wear look chic and stylish. Rinhala was in a bland, prosaic, purely practical jumpsuit, subdued and conservative. And yet, the way the neckline spread above those 4 pert green breasts, the way the material stretched across those swaying, rounded hindquarters. I think I am the one to determine if an act is an insult to me or not. She gave me a hard look, surprisingly intimidating from a Felra. Except that I didn't give a shit. Yeah, well, I think I am the one who's in charge here. So hold your temper, girlie. She didn't like that very much. But I, again, didn't give a shit. This was eating up too much of my valuable time already. Especially since I never did get to rub one out. Ah, well. Maybe I could get this silly crap wrapped up and have time to round up a bedmate for a quick tumble in the sheets. Maybe that short Dahoud demolitionist from the boarding party, Tremswy. Yeah, she was usually down for some freaky time with her dashing and sexy captain. Or with anybody, really. The only thing Tremswy wouldn't have a relationship with was chastity. She was like a less discriminating me, existentially horrifying as that thought ought to be. Rinhala held out a hand and OP obediently passed her the offending drawing. Tisk tisk. Was my old buddy getting a bit whipped? Rinhala's expression barely changed, merely a slight widening of her golden eyes and a little shift of her jaw. But Felra are big on that whole inscrutability thing, so that was basically a storm of emotion for one of them. Ah, she said. It would seem that someone has taken liberties with us. Yeah, well, that might be you in that drawing, but no way is that OP. That face looks nothing like her. Rinhala's jaw shifted again, tensing a bit. She took a deep breath and, without a second's warning, stepped over and shoved her hand down the front of OP's pants. She did some twiddly thing down there with her fingers that made OP's breath catch and eyes roll back in her head. The constant bitch lines on OP's broad, pale face smoothed out, her mouth opened just a little and her lips. I'll be damned. I didn't mean to say that, it just slipped out. 20 years as Ophelia Walczak's best bud, and I had no idea her face could do that. You really can look that fucking goofy. Gosh, the likeness is actually uncanny, said Dawn, sounding simultaneously embarrassed and impressed. For myself, I was unsure whether to be more astounded by the fact that Opie was capable of making that stupidly blissful look, or that Rinhala could get her to do it on demand. I also had to pout at the gods a little, too. Why couldn't I have been the one to get a dose of those sweet green fingers? May I assume my point to be proven? Rinhala's voice had a frost to it that even Felra charm didn't blunt. I just sighed and tapped the intercom again. Yo, Jilakita. Query, Captain. Can I ask why you? I stopped. This was getting stupider by the minute. Jilakita, open the damn door and let's talk in person like we all have some kind of sense. Emphatic assertion, negative, Captain. Statement, the sweet door shall remain in lockdown mode. I could have been back in my nice, soft bed with a nice, soft chick. Well, not that Tremswy was all that nice, the tripedal yellow minx. But she was very not nice in some very nice ways. But, no, I had to referee this shit, instead. While I'm about as known for personal restraint as I am for prudishness, the little that I did possess was about to go right out the airlock. Why? I asked, despite my urge to start punctuating my sentences with gunfire. Informed opinion, it is likely that Chief Engineer Walczak and/or Gunnery Officer Rinhala will seek to commit mayhem upon my person. No, they won't, I assured her. Not while I'm here. I sent a little warning glare at the two officers in question. Opie acknowledged that she'd heard me with a deepening of her already deeply bitchy glower, Rinhala not at all. I made mental note of that. There was a long pause. Then, opinion, the captain's assurances are not sufficient guarantee of my safety to warrant allowing access to my person at this time. Well, that was downright offensive. How dare she doubt either my honesty or my badassery? I wasn't sure which one Jilakita meant and, frankly, didn't care. I apologize for the confusion, 5th Officer Jilakita. That was not a fucking request. You're my subordinate and I'm giving you a direct order. Open this door. I didn't even bother trying to use the captain's override on the control system to open the door myself. Jilakita was a hacker. A very good one, and a former, professional criminal. If she hadn't long since put backdoors for herself into all the harlot's control systems, then she had no business being my cyber warfare officer. Query, would a refusal of this order constitute an act of mutiny on my part? Crevan voices, again, are flat and uninflected when speaking galactophonic. But there were some odd pauses here and there in Jilakita's question that would have been an unsteady little quaver in most other species. Yep. The very definition of. So you either open this door, or you hack the environmental controls to purge the Atmo from this deck and hope like hell it kills me, because you know how I deal with mutineers. I saw Opie blench at that, though neither Rinhala nor Dawn did. They were both too new to the harlot to know about that, having been brought on in the past year. I am, generally, a pretty easygoing boss. I recruit competent and motivated badasses, hand-picked gals who don't need a lot of close supervision to do their job in a fight. I don't keep much rein on what they do in their downtime either. It's not like I have a ship full of conscripts or cadets who require rigid structure and scheduled activity to keep them from killing their idiot selves. But I do have one very hard and immutable rule: challenge the captain and suffer. The harlot's blade is my ship. A ship can only have one captain, one person in charge, and that person is me. If you don't like it, you're free to leave. But try and usurp me, to deny me what's mine, to mutiny against me on my own ship, and I'll kill you. And not in a clean, professional way either. In the slow, evil kind of way people tell urban legends about. All my crew were aware of that rule, but only my old hands, of which Jilakita was one, had actually seen the consequences of breaking it with their own eyes. No pause at all in the response this time. Reluctant statement, understood, Captain. Statement, I will disengage lockdown mode and open the door for direct communication. Hopeful assertion, I depend upon you to forestall any assaults upon my person. I told you I would, I assured her as the orange indicators clicked off and the armored door swung open. The light-duty civvy ships most people are used to, liners and pleasure craft and the like, have doors that open by sliding into the bulkheads. Partly to maximize free space, but largely because it just looks more high-tech than old-school hinges, and high-tech appearance inspires civilians to have confidence in a starship. But slide-in doors are suicidal for a heavy combat vessel. One dent or deformation and the damn thing's jammed in place. On the Harlot, like most warships, light doors were fold-up and armored security doors were hinged. Jilakita stood there in the doorway, outwardly calm. But then, Crevan visual cues have always been hard reads for non-Crevan, especially us mammaloids. Like all her kind, Jilakita was a comically poofy ball of feathers topped by a round, slightly twitchy head whose most prominent feature was a 2-foot-long beak as thin and tapered as a rapier blade. Said poofy body was perched atop 4 stilty, talon-ended legs, the front 2 of which were usable as manipulators. 2 sets of stubby wings, neither of them large enough to actually lift a Creven into the air, jutted from her sides and would extend or retract to adjust her balance. The feathers were all a vaguely metallic bluish-gray color, although apparently they looked downright kaleidoscopic to Creven eyes, with their wider visual range. "Right," I said, "let's discuss this." And that was all I was able to get out before Renhala tried to lunge past me, a vicious snarl on her normally composed face. Sigh. Why the fuck do people have to be so predictable? Before she could get to Jilakita, I caught her by the wrist and stuck a boot in front of her back feet to trip her, pivoting and whirling her around once she was off balance. Those furious golden eyes turned on me, followed by a fist, which I hunched away from and took on the shoulder. "Renhala, don't." Opie's eyes were wide and uncharacteristically frightened. Our lovely Felra psychopath didn't answer verbally, but lashed at my head with the tip of her armored tail. Expecting that, I caught it in my free hand. Which stung like a bitch, I'll admit. A hook of my foot, a twist of my hips, 2 hard shifts of my weight, and we were on the deck plates, me on top with Renhala's captive arm twisted above her head. A little extra pressure, a few more degrees of torsion, and I'd wreck that elbow. Renhala bucked and strained under me, apparently unwilling to accept the situation. Hargren. Opie was holding out her hands, a placating gesture. But she didn't move to interfere. "You've made your point, all right." "Apparently I haven't," I snapped as Renhala continued to struggle against the hold I had her in. Had she been able to get her feet under her, I might have been in real trouble. Felra legs are as strong as they are sexy. But I'd brought her down onto her side and she couldn't get any traction. One arm was pinned underneath us, I had leverage on the other one, and that dangerous metal tail was firmly in my grasp. Felra tail muscles are fairly strong at the root, but puny toward the tip, so it was like holding the end of a whip that the wielder is trying to lash you with. She was beaten, but wouldn't admit it. An admirable quality in some circumstances, right then it was just pissing me off. So I got a foot under me to raise myself off her just a little. Before she could exploit that, I used the space to hoist up my other leg and knee her in the lower belly as hard as I could. I'd have gone for a good old boot to the cooch instead, if I'd had room enough and a good angle. The blow knocked the breath out of Renhala and set her guts to heaving. The frantic twisting and struggling under me subsided to mere tension. I let her gasp and cough there for a moment, not letting up my hold on her in the least. Felra can be sneaky bitches. I took a glance around at my audience. Opie's scowl had taken on a fretful tinge. Jilakita's beak and beady eyes were as immobile and unreadable as always, but she was shifting from foot to foot and her wings kept twitching out to stabilize her. The crew babes idling around down the corridor seemed duly impressed for the most part. Dawn just looked appalled. I put my muzzle down beside Renhala's dainty ear. Her tvan, the downy, ferny stuff Felra have instead of hair, smelled faintly of tropical flowers. "Renhala," I said, firmly but not unkindly, "you need to understand something. I know I can come across as kind of a buffoon. Comically egotistical, a fuzzy, lazy blowhard who just drinks and chases pussy. A goofy sex maniac. It's a fun image and I enjoy maintaining it. But..." Her eyes turned up toward me. Good, because this was an important and she needed to pay attention to it. The reason I am in charge of this outfit is not because I own this ship. It's not because I'm the most experienced and it's not even because I'm such a tactical genius. I smiled, showing all of my beautiful, pearly white, very sharp obligate carnivore teeth before moving those same teeth just a little closer to her soft and vulnerable face. It's because, I hissed, I am the deadliest bitch you will ever meet. It's because whenever anyone goes up against me, they absolutely fucking regret it. To punctuate, I gave her captive arm some extra torque. Something popped in there and she yelped at the sudden pain. Meh, I hadn't twisted far enough to do severe damage. Probably. Maybe. Whatever, there was a medic handy. I went on in a normal, conversational tone, glad that I hadn't sent the watching crew members on their way earlier. It would do them good to hear all this. I cut you some slack, Rinhala. Because you're still new here. Because you're a fucking mental case. Because Opie likes you and, frankly, because you're so hot. But now my forbearance is all used up for the day, so I'm asking you, in earnest, not playing at all, are you done? The shapely centauroid body under me tensed hard, just for a second, then went flaccid as Rinhala closed her eyes and let her head sink to the deck. She gave a weak little nod. Nope, I told her. You need to say it. Look at me, Rinhala. Tell me, to my face, that you're done fighting me and you'll follow orders now. She was proud and strong. I respected that and certainly didn't want to take those things from her. But she needed to understand her place here and, more importantly, mine. It took her a moment to gather the strength, not bodily, but the will, to speak again. But when she did, her voice was back to something approximating a typical cool and collected Felra purr. I am done fighting you, Captain. She let out a slightly ragged sigh. I place myself under your authority. I smiled at her, less threateningly this time, and released her arm. There. See, that needn't have been so rough. And now we're all buddies again. I let go of her tail and got off of her. If not for Opie and their thing, I might have given her a little parting smooch or a pat on the rump. But as it was, I just let her go and concentrated on not letting on that my left hand hurt like a son of a bitch from catching that metal tail. As Rinhala climbed to somewhat shaky feet, Dawn rushed over to her and started fussing and clucking over that elbow I'd hyperextended. Opie didn't, but merely gave me the barest little nod. Which, having known her for so long, I easily translated as, hey, thanks for not murdering the chick I like, you vacuous tunnel cunt. Or something equally heartwarming and profane. One good thing about sudden acts of unexpected violence is that they do a wonderful job of focusing attention on the one performing them and clearing away extraneous discussion. I clapped my hands and said, now, let's get back to business. Jilakita, you've drawn this troublesome erotic artwork of your fellow officers Walkzak and Rinhala. Why have you done this? Kreven tend to be very literal in conversation and are all about giving responses that are technically correct. Statement, this artwork furthers the plotline of my graphic novel. Ah, right. She'd mentioned a graphic novel before. And what graphic novel is this? Statement, the title is Jilakita Presents Titillating Activities Aboard a Privately Owned Combat Starship, Volume 3. It took a moment to process that. And not just for me, apparently. I was getting silence and what the fuck looks from the others, too. Although Dawn's was more of what the heck, since Iratrians don't really curse. So, am I to understand that you've drawn 3 full volumes of pictures of these two getting freaky together? Statement, your understanding is incorrect, Captain. Then correct it for me. Jilakita did the shifting from foot to foot thing again, wings flicking out in time with her movements. Correction, I have not only drawn, but written, printed, and distributed these works. Correction, there exist not 3, but 5 volumes of Jilakita Presents Titillating Activities Aboard a Privately Owned Combat Starship. Correction, the volumes consist of plot, dialogue, and narration as well as artwork. Correction, the artwork and storylines are not limited to encounters between Chief Engineer Walkzak and Gunnery Officer Rinhala. Elaboration, storylines featuring Chief Engineer Walkzak and Gunnery Officer Rinhala do predominate, due to their popularity with the readers. The little crest of feathers on top of Jilakita's head ruffled up, then back down. Assertion, this should sufficiently correct your understanding, Captain. Query, may I return to my duties, now that our discussion is complete? Everybody's what the fuck looks became even what the fuckier. Even Dawn's. You may not, I snapped before Jilakita could step back and shut the door. You can't drop a bomb like that and then just walk away. Technical correction: immediate departure from the blast radius is the recommended procedure following the deployment of a bomb. Metaphor, Jilakita. Metaphor. I scowled at her. And don't act like you don't know what that is, since you're apparently an author now. Surprisingly, Dawn was the first one to recover and jump back into the conversation, if a bit stammery and looking like she was about to hyperventilate. Which she did not do when she was being shot at, oddly enough. Who else features in these storylines of yours? Statement: my storylines feature the other members of the crew of the Harlot's Blade, with the exceptions of the captain and second officer Hunka. So, am I. Dawn had let go of Renhala's damaged arm and was wringing her manipulators, all four hooves clattering nervously in place. Jilakita's response was immediate. Statement: Volume 2, Chapter 2, Medical Officer Dawnlight conducts in-depth studies of Dahu gynecology with Tremswy, Ronmi, Selswi, and Tolgda. I found myself wanting to read that one. Dawn, however, reacted like she'd just been told she was pregnant and the baby wasn't hers. That delightful ass of hers plopped to the deck and her manipulators whipped around to pull at her mane. But be that as it may, I had a more pressing issue to worry about. Opie beat me to the punch, though. You draw everybody but Hargren and Hunka, she demanded. Why do Captain Spreadlegs and the Green Glacier get a pass? Some of my crew privately referred to my second-in-command and boarding party commander, Hunka Vekratharns, as the Green Glacier. Green, because she was a reptiloid Jixavan whose scales were mostly, green. Glacier because she was cold, steady, and utterly implacable. Hunka had been a Galactic Commerce Guard cop for 2 decades before I hired her away, and everyone knows the Guard recruits for 2 traits: quick thinking and dispassionate brutality. Hunka exercised both with judicious competence. She was honestly the best second I'd ever worked with. Opie was my BFF and all, but Hunka outranked her because she lacked Opie's volatility and had this sort of deadpan anti-charisma that somehow steadied and motivated the troops. One of the few crew members whose ass had no bearing at all on me hiring them. Although, it wasn't too shabby, either. Statement: I asked Second Officer Hunka for permission to use her likeness. Statement: permission was denied. We would have denied you, too. Opie spat. So why did you ask her beforehand and not us? Jilakita did the weight-shifting thing again. Informed opinion: because I believed an angry response on your part to be most likely survivable. Assertion: it was likely that you would express displeasure with my work through open hostility and probable direct physical assault the moment you discovered it, which could be detected and defended against until your emotions had subsided. Assertion: it is virtually guaranteed that Second Officer Hunka would express displeasure with my work by making no outward show of dissatisfaction for as long as necessary, until such time as she had opportunity to quietly slit my throat and dispose of my corpse without witnesses. Yeah, I couldn't argue with that assessment. What I could argue with, and vehemently, was, well and good, but why aren't you drawing porn of me? Statement: it is a matter of supply and demand. Clarifying statement: the distribution of my graphic novels is intended to turn a profit. Are you saying people don't want to see me naked? I asked, dead calm. I'd killed people in ugly ways for lesser insults. Emphatic assertion: negative. Clarifying statement: it is about pricing and competition. Elaboration: it is difficult to charge suitable rates for artistic renderings of the captain's genitalia when the captain readily displays her genitalia in person upon little or no pretext. I had to nod. Okay, that's fair. Renhala had recovered some of her poise, if not much of her ulnar mobility, and seemed about to re-enter the conversation in an attractively disheveled state somewhere between mid-umbrage and high dudgeon. Preempting her, so as to cut down on the arguments and emotionalism, I pointed at Jilakita and said, all right. Direct order, Captain to Cyber Warfare Officer, explain to us how and why you came to do this. No, technically correct answers. Details. I folded my arms and fixed Jilakita with one of my imperious and commanding stares. Although, to be honest, I was kind of thinking about what she'd look like, sash off, feathers spread, and oviduct aperture thrust out. Hey, I've got certain tastes. And proclivities. Needs. All sorts of psychological stuff that I can't help, and really enjoy indulging. Resigned statement, Captain. Jilakita took a step or two back, either for prudence's sake before revealing her nefarious scheme or unease at all my imperious and commanding stuff. Statement. The germination of my graphic novel project began when I was observing a carnal liaison between Chief Engineer Walczak and Gunnery Officer Rinhala via the ship's internal security video feed. Oh ho! Rinhala snarled. She leaned toward Jilakita, but didn't go for another rush at her. Might have been because she was smart enough not to try me a second time, or because Dawn had resumed checking out her elbow and had hold of her arm. So, you have violated our privacy. Jilakita turned those blank black eyes Rinhala's way. Rhetorical query, what privacy? Evidentiary statement, a cruise on the Harlot's Blade consists of 116 individuals aboard a medium-sized warship in tight personal proximity for months at a time. Evidentiary statement, all warships contain internal security video systems. Evidentiary statement, my shipboard role is the penetration and exploitation of secured data systems. Extended evidentiary statement, this ship's security video feed constitutes just such a system. Concluding opinion, an expectation of privacy under such conditions, particularly from the attentions of the cyber warfare officer, would be an act of dubious sanity. She had a point. You put 100+ women of any species in close quarters for long stretches, and everybody will know everybody else's business in short order. I sometimes think it lends credence to the Venjari Crusaders' belief that most sapient life was intentionally seeded by a progenitor, the fact that certain female traits seem to just be universal. Which may be why I universally love or at least lust after my fellow females of every breed and creed. Plus, it wasn't like Rinhala and Opie were being all that discreet in their activities. The aft drone hangar practically had a fog of lady spunk hanging in the air from those two going at it. So, yeah, expecting privacy in this situation might have been of dubious sanity. Then again, dubious described Rinhala's sanity pretty accurately, so. Jilakita continued. Statement. While observing the chief engineer and gunnery officer having sex, I became somewhat frustrated. Disappointed assertion, their activities were insufficiently titillating for me to successfully pleasure myself to them. Now Opie flared up again. Hold on, chicken snatch. You spy on us fucking and then have the nerve to complain that we're boring you? I raised a cautioning hand. I thought I could see a vein throbbing in Opie's neck and didn't want her to have an aneurysm or something. Calmly, I explained, now, Opie, remember that Jilakita is both a Crevan and a huge nerd. What gets her off is going to be all kinds of fucked up by normal people's standards. Jilakita, being a Crevan, was unable to make her face look offended at my comment. So Dawn apparently decided to look offended on her behalf. That's very culturally insensitive, Captain, she chided. It only sounds that way because I don't give a shit, Dawn. Oh. Okay, then. She went back to working on Rinhala's arm. I turned back to Jilakita. Anyway, you were watching these two get frisky and it wasn't doing it for you. Then what? Statement. In my youth, I had drawn erotic artwork of characters from various fictional works and posted them to the hyperweb, where they had proven somewhat popular. Prideful assertion, my new drawings of the female flitterwings from the Jixavan 3V series Docky the Fuzzy Lizard earned me considerable online reputation. Isn't Docky the Fuzzy Lizard a cartoon show? Dawn asked. Statement, yes. Confused query, what is your point? Never mind, I said, motioning for Jilakita to go on. Nerd porn. Sheesh. Jilakita preened a wing feather before continuing. Statement, it occurred to me that, if the sex acts performed by the chief engineer and gunnery officer were not sufficiently stimulating for me, then I could use my artistic talent to depict them engaging in acts that were like nude differential calculus. Statement: precisely, Captain. The feathers around Gilakita's oviduct aperture fluttered and flared for a moment, then stilled again. Statement: I then created what would later become the first chapter of the first volume, titled Chief Engineer Walczak and Gunnery Officer Renhala Calculate the Trajectory of Their Arousal. Assertion: it was effective in its intended purpose. Statement: I was able to achieve orgasm during both creation and later perusal of the work in question. Opie's hands were clenched, which worried me. The woman had fists like sledgehammers. But she ended up just raising them into the air as she looked toward the ceiling and growled, "Jan Powell, saint of my people. Is it too much for you to ask the Almighty to smite this heathen fuckvulture?" Apparently it was, because Gilakita remained unsmote. Also, it always cracked me up how the strength of Opie's religious faith seemed to exist in direct proportion to how uncomfortable she was. Opie in a burning engine room with a reactor going critical, devoutly Catholic. Opie chained to an altar by cultists, about to be bloodily sacrificed, super Catholic. Opie in a Temethran brothel with 3 high-class call girls, 4 gallons of vodka, and $250,000 in pocket money, just a fedora away from atheism. Gilakita just stared at Opie for a moment, then went on. Statement: 2 days after creating this first erotic comic, I was in discussion with the crew member who goes by the alias Ace. Ace was a Marine on the boarding party, a Zarg like me, but smaller, not as sexy, and not much more than a kid. Way older than I was when I first got started in the business, and a legal adult, but still pretty damn young. Many of the crew seemed to believe she was my baby sister or a cousin or some such, going under an alias so no one would know. That wasn't true. Ace and I were not related. As far as I knew, anyway. I hoped we weren't, because I fully intended to get around to shagging her one day, and my sins don't extend to either incest or nepotism. Statement: Ace was in possession of a rare video game patch file on datachip that I wished to copy. Statement: I offered a printout of my erotic comic in trade. Assertion: it was the nearest equivalent in value and desirability to what Ace was offering. None of what you just said makes me want to kill you any less, Renhala snapped. Dawn patted her lower back in a supportive there gesture. Statement: Ace claimed to greatly enjoy my work and requested more of it. Statement: she expressed a willingness to pay for further installments, if need be. Assertion: both Ace's interest and her offer to pay money for my art were extremely gratifying. Statement: I therefore created a second installment, featuring Ace and sensor technician Vlasildan. Not a bad casting choice, I had to admit. Vlasildan was our other Felra, a middle-aged ex-pirate who had reformed after we curb-stomped her old gang. A refreshingly stable mix of grace, intellect, and hard-headed pragmatism, that one. Statement: the title was Ace Appraises, then thoroughly taxes Vlasildan's pirate booty. Renhala shook her head and sighed, the insult that I feel is now moving from being on a personal level to an aesthetic one. Statement: Ace affirmed her enjoyment of this second comic. Modifying statement: she asserted, however, that the first one was of superior quality. Statement: Ace further stated that she had shared both comics with her squad mate, Ruckn. Ruckn was the other half of Ace's fire team on the boarding party, a Tarkage who had eagerly defected to us during one of our raids into the Tark Imperium. Some worried that she might be a mole inserted by the known galaxy's second biggest oxymoron, eclipsed only by journalistic integrity, Tark Imperial Intelligence. But if she was a TII spy, she was a damn deep one, because the gal mowed down Tark soldiers and secret police with gleeful abandon. I had no idea what made her that way. I did know that with those breathing slits in her neck instead of a nose on her face, her Tarkage anatomy lent itself to extended bouts of pretty good oral. Statement: Ruckn concurred with Ace's evaluation of the comparative quality of the two works. Statement: I was puzzled by this, as I felt my art and writing styles had improved with practice. Hypothesis: logically, qualitative improvements should result in a superior product. Assessment: my sample size of both works and readers was insufficient to provide useful data in this matter. Statement: I therefore created third and fourth installments, titled The Damage Control Team Forms a Highly Irregular Hyperbolic Polygon, and TREMSY, and told to insert digits into each other's pi, respectively. Not going to lie, I was actually loving those chapter titles. More than that, I was enjoying the effect they had on the others, especially Dawn. I'm pretty sure she was mouthing a silent prayer on Jilakita's behalf to the Iratrian god of arts and letters, while Opie and Rinhala were both oscillating between existential dismay and the kind of helpless rage that drives people to take up ideologies. Admittedly, I'm kind of a terrible person with a weird and vicious sense of humor. My joking did have a limit, and that limit involved the word browbeat, but the only things keeping me from laughing out loud at both Jilakita and Dawn were, first, the need to be in commander mode for the crew babes watching, and, second, the fact that I still really needed to rub one out and all this horny art talk wasn't helping. Opinion: these installments were met with considerable enthusiasm by Ace and Rucken. Assertion: I had put yet more effort into the art style, detail, and accuracy. Jilakita stood up straighter and puffed out her neck feathers. Prideful assertion: I felt particular satisfaction with the definitive and consistent geometry of the damage control team's limbs and power tools throughout the zero-gravity warp space orgy scene. Meh, a zero-G gangbang is one of those things that's not as much fun as it sounds. Somebody's always drifting out of reach or flailing around to keep a hold on you. Every time you get good, solid contact with a set of body parts, you risk giving yourself momentum away from those same bits. It might be different with guys, I wouldn't know, but a proper all-female orgy absolutely requires a firm foothold and a certain amount of traction for true enjoyment, at least in my experience. It's just one of those cases where reality has disappointing conditions imposed upon it that fantasy does not. Statement: despite my assessment of the comic's superior quality, they were still considered inferior to my first. Assertion: a larger pool of readers was required to determine whether this opinion was a mere outlier. Opie shook her head, a gesture of resigned dread. So you spread it among the whole fucking crew, right? Jilakita did the foot-shifting thing again. Statement: later on, yes. Statement: at that time, to achieve the largest possible data pool, I posted the comics I had drawn to the hyperweb. You, what? Somebody hissed dangerously. Surprisingly enough, that somebody turned out to be Dawn. Reiterated statement: I posted the comics to the hyperweb. Clarification: specifically, I posted them to the Behold It subforum for mercenary fandom, /we love mercs. Based on the others' responses, a six-fingered green hand to the forehead, flattened ears and clattering hooves, and a groan of, one smiting, Jan Powell. Just one, respectively, they knew what that Behold It thing was and had opinions about it. Me, not so much. I don't go on the hyperweb that often. Business or pleasure, I prefer my social interactions to be with people I can physically get my hands on. Folks are just so much more polite and agreeable when you're conversing within stabbing distance. I take it that meant a lot of exposure. I put a bit of emphasis on that word, because even the lamest double entendre is better than no double entendre. For your work. Opinion: in galactic hyperweb terms, a small but non-trivial amount, Jilakita explained. Statement: the mercenary fandom subforum is a small one by Behold It standards. Speculation: based upon the number of comments received, the total number of beholders who viewed my artwork is unlikely to top 10 million. Rinhala made a noise like she just accidentally sucked a nipple piercing down her throat as her tail-tip skitter scraped back and forth across the deck. Opie muttered something fur-curlingly vile in Polish and started thumping her forehead against the wall. Jilakita fake casually took another step backwards at the sight before continuing. Assessment: based on reader feedback, the general consensus seemed to confirm the superior art quality of the newer chapters, but the greater enjoyability of the first despite that. Statement: the reason articulated by the majority that held this view was that the carnal pairing of Gunnery Officer Renhala and Chief Engineer Walczak was superior in appeal to all other sexual combinations presented. That was not a thing I ever expected to hear. People think OP is sexy. OP. I mean, yeah, artistic interpretation covers a multitude of chubby sins and all, but OP? That OP right there. OP stopped headwalling and rounded on me. Hey, choke on a rancid pube, Hargren. I can be sexy and feminine. She can, indeed. Renhala was glaring at me, too. I can vouch for this. Statement: the readers assured me that this is the case. Corroborating statement: a great many reader comments made reference to their affinity for, quote, pudgy angry Njamami. I like to think that the peal of gut-tearing laughter that came out of me at that point was caused by a combination of mood whiplash and cognitive dissonance. It was a complex psychological response thing and not at all just me taking infantile delight in the phrase, pudgy angry Njamami. OP, on the other hand, looked borderline catatonic. Jilakita waited until I had my hilarity under control before going on. Statement: they expressed particular enjoyment of pudgy angry Njamami being paired with, quote, murder butt. Murder butt? Renhala's voice was so cold, it could stiffen a nipple at 100 yards. Is this another bad joke on your part? Tell me that people do not really refer to me by the epithet murder butt. If Jilakita was fazed by that, she didn't let on. Statement: that is your nickname among the mercenary fandom. Assessment: it would appear to be a reference to your weaponized prosthetic tail. Renhala did not seem to appreciate the help. I am quite aware what it's a fucking reference to. Elaboration: the fans like to say that you, quote, put the ass in assassination. Dawn cocked her head, suddenly puzzled. Aren't there two ISSes in assassination? I wonder if they're referring to the first one, the second one, or both. And if it were both, would that really be complimentary? Because it sounds like that would imply that your rear was big enough to be two. Dawn wound down as she realized we were all staring at her. What? I just think people should express themselves with clarity, that's all. Anyway. Assertion: I hypothesized at the time that it was primarily Gunnery Officer Renhala's presence that provided the appeal. Statement: in proof of this, I created and posted a short comic titled Glasildan and Gunnery Officer Renhala Solved Their Two-Body Problem. Evidentiary statement: Felra are widely considered to be the galaxy's sex symbols. Hypothesis: erotic art of two Felra together should prove more popular than erotic art depicting a Felra with a human. Jilakita's feathers made a full-body ruffle, head to tail. It was the Crevan response to something that tasted too foul to be swallowed, an expression of inward-oriented disgust. Statement: my prediction proved not only false, but entirely counterfactual. Assessment: reader response to this comic's posting ranged from negative to profane to threats against my person. Dawn looked confused again. Wait. People complained about and even threatened you over creative content that you provided them for free? Who behaves like that? Oh dear. It seemed that a certain Iratrian had managed to go her whole life without any understanding of either sapient nature or how people behave on the hyperweb. Of course people would bitch and moan about things that someone went to a lot of effort to provide them for free. People suck. I shoot people and ruin their stuff as a business model, and one of the reasons I don't feel bad about doing it is that people are, as a general rule, assholes. If I put a blaster bolt into somebody for a fee, well, odds are that they had it coming anyway. Statement: yes. Assessment: reader complaints were many and vehement. Statement: the general majority and all of the most verbose in expressing their ire primarily took issue with the pairing of Gunnery Officer Renhala with someone other than Chief Engineer Walczak. Statement: many of the missives I received expressed hostility to the very idea of Gunnery Officer Renhala being, quote, unfaithful to Chief Engineer Walczak. Elaboration: many of those missives also accused me of having ulterior motives, evil intentions, or a poor upbringing for writing and drawing such a story. Having known Jilakita for about 10 years at that point, I could vouch for the fact that she did, indeed, have ulterior motives and evil intentions most of the time. They were exactly why I had hired her to cyberfuck opposing forces for me. As for her upbringing, her parents and broodmates were a pretty stodgy bunch. But they were all in the financial industry, so there certainly could have been some spillover malevolence there. Further elaboration: a common refrain in those messages and to a lesser degree among the mercenary fandom in general was the cryptic equation PAEM plus MB equals OTP. Statement: I subsequently learned that this equation is shorthand for pudgy angry Enjimami plus murder but equals one true pairing. That was actually kind of sweet in a cringy, geekish, socially maladapted sort of way. Leave it to a bunch of obsessive hyperweb dweebs and fanboying techno-nerds to turn someone's relationship into a stupid acronymed rallying cry to fixate on for. Wait. Nerds. Techno-nerds. A spark lit in the back of my mind, a little ember trying to set my thoughts ablaze. There was something here. It was like when I was looking at a tactical plot of an opposing force and spotted a suboptimally positioned picket ship or a blind spot in a gun's firing arc. I sensed opportunity. A tactical advantage, a force multiplier waiting to be ruthlessly exploited. It was just a matter of working out exactly how. Jilakita was nattering on about her readers finding OP to be a more relatable and attainable sex object than the prettier but more aloof and emotionally distant Felra, because human cross-cultural biosocial adaptability in OP's juxtaposition of aggression with vulnerability and a bunch of other blah 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 that was probably bullshit. I tuned most of that out, because I was putting together a plan. I don't just make the big money because I'm sexy and charming and come from a famous military clan. Certified tactical genius, baby. Clients happily shell out the standards and my gals live to spend them because my brain is one of this galaxy's most dangerous fucking weapons. Oh. Opie was looking at me, her glower tempered with curiosity. I recognized that glazed look. That's Hargren's I'm so bloody smart face. That's the expression she gets when she's thinking up a new way to hurt people and destroy property. Dawn was peering up at me, too. Really? She asked Opie, muzzle wrinkling. She looks kind of lecherous. Nah. Opie shook her head. When Hargren's thinking up new forms of lechery, her mouth hangs open and her left ear twitches. Everybody who's not me, shut up, I growled. This just got important. That made Rinhala turn indignant eyes my way, but that pain in her arm seemed to be a good reminder not to cross me again, because she kept her trap shut. A glance to the crew babes loitering down the corridor and a jerk of my head sent them scurrying off to their stations and out of earshot. I held up my hands like I was holding an invisible orb, not the titty kind, turning and shaping it before my face. It was an old family trick for visualizing plans and holding focus. Jilakita, I drawled. You said you were making a profit. You've been selling these drawings. The buyers. They're the same as or similar to your beholded audience. Jilakita's glass bead eyes turned to me, any nervous shifting or ruffling put aside as she caught my own focus. Assessment: there is significant overlap between my beholded readers and those who purchase my graphic novels. Statement: the sets are not identical. Elaboration: due to the way I market my work and its somewhat niche nature, the demographics of the two sets can be described as fundamentally similar. Nerds, then, I breathed. Horny but asocial, tech-focused, mid-level brainiacs. A lot of them Creven. I smoothed one side of my imaginary mystical orb. Dawn had to chastise me, of course. That's a little cruel, Captain. You shouldn't stereotype. I flicked an ear at her, but didn't otherwise look or gesture at her. Hush, Dawn. I'm not denigrating, I'm delineating. Nerds are a category of sapience, and an important one. No government or military or corporation in this galaxy can operate without nerds. Like Jilakita, here. She's our nerd and we couldn't keep up the harlot's command and control networks without her. Nerds are the backbone of the whole galaxy's information and controls infrastructure. A slow smile started creeping across my muzzle. And Jilakita is selling downloads to thousands of them. I twisted my fingers, shaping the other side of my thought orb. Correction, millions of them, Jilakita said. As always, nothing in her voice but chirpy monotone, but the little crest of feathers on top of her head twitched, just a little, and began to stand up. Statement: these downloads are relatively simple graphic files and typically downloaded into readers or e-slates, when not simply printed off as hard copies. Aha! But you just know at least a few of them are going into computers. Even work computers. I turned the imaginary orb in my hands, pondering how best to mold it to the shape I needed. OP wasn't a combat officer and not much for tactics aside from straightforward bashing. But she was both technical-minded and fairly devious when her emotions weren't running rampant. She saw what we were getting at. Her eyes narrowed as they flicked between Jilakita and me. You're talking malware. You're talking about seeding viruses or something in with the downloads. Jilakita made an indignant fluff of her tail feathers, an uncommonly blatant Crevan gesture. Shocked assertion: it would be both illegal and immoral to place malware in the downloads purchased by adoring fans. Offended assertion: the mere suggestion that I would do so would demean my honor as an artist. Sure it would, I agreed. If you weren't already a seriously illegal and immoral little bundle of feathers and depravity. Jilakita's past cybercrimes and personal lifestyle choices had left her wanted, dead or alive, by 7 planetary governments, for interstellar crime syndicates, 2 religions, and an entire professional sports league. And even after 10 years, we still had to occasionally deal with Bogrican Republic bounty hunters, Pentad path zealots, and pissed-off pro-lawn dart players looking for payback in a payday. Jilakita's tail feathers flared again. Assertion: I resent the automatic assumption that I would engage in criminal activity simply because the opportunity presents itself. I'm sure you do resent it. But I have yet to hear an actual denial that you've done it. Those hard little unreadable eyes fixed on me and her beak opened and closed a couple of times. She finally answered with chagrined assertion: the speaking of blatant untruths without instinctively appending the preface, prevarication, to them is exceedingly difficult for a Crevan. Statement: due to the simple and relatively basic nature of the graphics files used to construct the downloads of my graphic novels, most executable hostile programs nested within them are too easily detected to be viable as malware. Statement: I was able to develop a pared-down keylogger which conceals itself as a search and bookmarking tool within the graphic novel's reader aid files. Statement: this keylogger has been inserted into every download of my work since Volume 3. Assessment: while the keylogger is functional at its task, its utility as a cyber warfare tool is limited by its bare-bones nature and the simple nature of the devices it is typically installed into. I smoothed at the side of my imaginary orb. So, a more complicated attack program like a backdoor or a worm or data wiper would require a larger and more elaborate program to hide itself in. What about spaghetti coding the graphic files to bulk them up? Though Jilakita's response was still monotone, I was sure I could detect some of the disdain of a specialist fielding dumb suggestions from a layman in her reply. Which was fine, since being a justifiably arrogant specialist was what I paid her for. Assessment: that would only result in the downloads being scrutinized more closely, as there would be no reason other than the concealment of malware to use such coding or to have enlarged file sizes for mere graphics. A bump on my orb, but one that could be easily polished down. Okay. So, something more innately tangled and multi-layered than simple graphics, then. Something interactive. A game? Though that came out as a question, I could feel the truth, the rightness of it even as the words left me. So I repeated it as a clear statement, because what do nerds love just as much as fucked up comic book sex? Yeah, a game. The orb was nice and round, now. Jilakita's crest feathers went straight vertical, but she didn't say anything. I could tell her brain was whirring along at max speed, her mind off in the same place mine was. What do you mean? Dawn began, looking back and forth between us. Opie cut her off with a curt swipe of the hand. Shoo, Hargren's in the zone, she hissed. It's like when a genius composer gets inspired, except the resulting symphony is made out of fire and dead people. It might have been the single nicest thing Opie ever said about me. Dawn managed to look adorably horrified. Jilakita spoke slowly, eyes on the imaginary globe in my hand. Rumination, an interactive program could be made, allowing the user to guide animated versions of the chief engineer and gunnery officer from my graphic novels through a sexual relationship. Speculative statement, minigames based upon theoretical mathematics could be used along with a highly varied decision tree to increase the complexity. Speculative statement, minigame victories and correct decisions could be rewarded with sex scenes of escalating complexity and titillation value. My evil smile threatened to split my muzzle. Make it complex enough that they'll want to run the game on a really high-end computer for full effect. Like their work terminal, if they're government or corporate management types. My orb was becoming a true thing of beauty. Assertion, jiggle physics. Statement, if we realistically animate the jiggle and bounce of Chief Engineer Walczak's body parts, the required physics engine could be used to conceal a remote-enable virus. We could also jiggle Physic Renhala's tits, I reminded. Assertion, Gunnery Officer Renhala's body is much more taut and has a significantly lower jiggle factor than the Chief Engineer's, despite her larger number of breasts. Assertion, animating the movement of her tresses in detail, on the other hand, would tie up considerable processing power. A Felra's locks of Tvan, what they have atop their heads instead of hair or fur, bear a vague resemblance to masses of silky fern fronds made out of tiny green feathers. And even the least vain of Felra tend to wear theirs in complicated styles. Have a dramatic breeze blowing in every scene with her. It'll look all romantic and shit, too. Affirmation, indeed, Captain. Assertion, for the program sizes we are talking, concealing tailored data wiper/swipers, assault replicators, or backdoors could be done without difficulty. Assessment, developing such a detailed game is beyond my own capabilities. Recommendation, a dedicated game dev limited virtual intelligence or two could be purchased to expedite the process. The two of us were truly in sync now. We'll position one of my clan's phony shell companies as a video game publisher and buy the developer LVIs through it to obscure the connection to us. Dawn turned deeply troubled eyes Opie's way. They're talking about committing cybercrime. Opie shook her head. No. They're talking about committing cyber warfare. That's totally different, because we benefit from it. She swung a hard expression my way. They're also talking about selling cyberporn of me without my permission. You know, the thing that got me so fucking pissed off in the first place. Her voice rose all the way through that last sentence. I sighed. My orb was near perfection now. Just these last few irregularities to polish out. No, Opie. I'm talking about marketing cyberporn of you with your enthusiastic consent. And why the fuck would I give you that? She folded her arms across her chest. For a cut of the action. How does 5% of the profit sound? She gave a theatrical sneer. 5% of something that doesn't exist yet sounds like jack shit. Then how about 5% of something that does? I inclined my head toward Jilakita. She's already sold a few million copies of those comics books. Jilakita held up a talon to interrupt. Offended correction, they are graphic novels. A few million copies of her nerdy smut books, I went on, because I'm kind of a bitch that way. How does 5% of that action as well sound? I held up a finger. Millions, Opie. Millions. Opie's sullen pout stilled and then went pensive. 10%, she spat after a few seconds' consideration. I shook my head. 5, because you don't actually have to do any work at all other than to keep delighting the galaxy's mercenary fanboys by being your pudgy angry Enjimami self. Opie chewed at her lip for a second, then shrugged, the fatalism of her people taking hold as her anger subsided. Sucka, she growled. The drawings are already out there, so it's not like I can unfuck that goat. And using Casimir, that was Opie's name for her favorite adjustable wrench and preferred melee weapon, the one she kept stuck in her boot. To knock Jilakita's brains out her asshole would be no more than a passing pleasure. She threw up her hands. All right, fine. I'm on board for 5%. A ruffle of tail feathers cut into our conversation as Jilakita stepped forward. Statement: I never said I would be amenable to such a division of my profits. That's fine, I assured her. We can just forget the whole deal and you can get on with your intimate and probably brief acquaintance with Casimir, then. Tail feathers immediately subsided. Statement: I never said I would not be amenable to an equitable division of my profits either. Then, of course, Rinhala had to jump in, sounding not the least bit mollified. This is all very well, she snapped, but what about me? 5%, of course, I told her. You are the co-star, after all. Flat fee of 5,000 per story appearance for everybody else, since they're not the main draw. I didn't want Dawn to feel left out. Rinhala shook her head angrily. Not what I mean, Captain. You offer monetary compensation, but not all of us are so materialistic. Mere money could never soothe the insult that has been done to me and that you now speak of doing further. To give the girl her due, she looked quite ready to throw down with me again over the issue, down by one arm or not. And while I don't appreciate or reward serious challenges to my command, I do appreciate guts and willingness to stick to principles. Fortunately, I had an answer. Let me set a scene for you, Rinhala. We're moving into gunnery range of an enemy station. Their defenses are up and manned, weapons online, shields at full charge. It's a big station, well fortified, way more than a match for any mere privateer cruiser, and they know it. Just as both sides are getting weapon locks, Jilakita establishes a hyperweb link and activates an attack program unknowingly inserted into the station's defense coordination network by some dweeby shield operator who loaded a pervy game that he bought from us into his workstation. Those big, battleship-grade shields flicker and falter and fizzle out, the station's gun turrets begin losing their points of aim. There's nothing but desperation and chaos on the other side as their whole defense plan unravels. Fear runs rampant. Orders and counterorders ring out, only adding to the panic as nothing can be made to work. The enemy lies helpless, shivering before us, bared to our desires and ripe for the taking, with no hope but our own savage mercy. And then you hear me say those four sweet, sweet words that you love so very much. I leaned forward, pursing my lips like I was crooning to her and breathed, You may open fire. Rinhala shut her eyes and her duralloy tail curled under her, tight against her belly. She made a little sound halfway between a squeak and a cough as her hips quivered just a little. Apologies, Captain, she whispered once the moment was past, opening her eyes again and looking at the floor. I think I just came. Our impromptu grouping took that as the cue to break up. Dawn, fretting and shaking her head like a good little Iratrian moralist, led Rinhala off to the infirmary to scan her elbow and shoot some tendon repair nanites in there and hopefully get her a change of panties. Opie stomped off back toward the engine room. Presumably to do her job but, knowing her, probably to do some vodka-assisted philosophical brooding on the nature of her existence and her role in her God's grand design for the universe as a pudgy angry Enjimami. Jilakita started back into the cyber warfare suite, but I grabbed her by a wing feather. My beautiful little mind orb of a plan was not quite perfect yet. Those black bead eyes revealed nothing but my own dark reflection. Query: Is there something further you require, Captain? There is. One last thing remains to be smoothed out. Jilakita just stared for a moment, presumably thinking. Statement: we have formed a plan of action and the necessary individuals have given their support and been compensated. I smiled at her and shook my head. One very important person hasn't been compensated yet. I tapped myself on the chest. Assertion: I assume you will want a percentage of my graphic novel sales as well as the majority stake in game sales by your shell company. I shook my head again. Not what I'm talking about. Her feather was light and silky smooth in my fingers. I'm talking about all the trouble you caused in the first place. Trouble that got me out of bed and up here refereeing the lot of you when I could have been doing something so much more fun. And then you offend me, wound me, even. By leaving my fabulous body out of your erotica, too. I clucked my tongue, then did that trick where I wrap it all the way around my muzzle. The feathers around Jilakita's oviduct aperture flared a little and she dipped her head in acceptance. Assertion: I am at my captain's orders. Query: how might I compensate my captain for the inconvenience my actions have caused her? There. Now the imaginary orb that was my plan was perfect and complete. It could be set aside, ready for use. So when my hand cupped and made a polishing motion this time, it was not in the air before my face, but down a smooth and delicate wing to a muscular, fluff-covered thigh. Get your art supplies, I told her. Be in my cabin in 10 minutes. I'll go get Tremswy and... I trailed off into a laugh. Jilakita pressed her thigh against my hand. Query: and what, Captain? I drew her close and gave her a little smooch beside the beak. And then we'll see if we three can't get up to something that will feature in your next book.